Welcome to another Dynasty Rankings deep dive. With a bumper crop of rookie pass catchers entering the league, I'll be taking you through my wide receiver rankings. Who should you buy? Who should you sell? And how do you value them against this year's rookies? All that and more on the Fantasy First Down. To the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can check out our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com, where we've got rookie rankings, we've got redraft rankings, and we've got our updated dynasty rankings, plus heaps of articles and heap of other recordings just like this. Today we're going through wide receiver dynasty rankings, and firstly, welcome to the new podcast studio. It's still a work in progress. The microphone's not here yet, so I apologize if my voice doesn't sound quite right and the lighting's a bit off, but we're working on it and it's going to get better hopefully in the future as well. I'm keen to get into this because the wide receiver is the deepest position. We've got a lot of good rookies coming in as well, so there's a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. Today, we're starting off at number one because what better place to start? And it's CeeDee Lamb. He had a fantastic season last season, finished top of the pops, and he goes to the top of my rankings as well. I don't see any reason to think he'll take a step back. They haven't brought in any real competition for him. They definitely have no running back competition. Their number two wide receiver at the moment is Brandon Cooks, and he's getting a lot older. He's into his 30s. Jake Ferguson isn't exactly good competition. So I think it's this a CeeDee Lamb show, at least for the near future. They're surely going to bring in some guys at some stage, but he's the clear number one guy there. I don't see that changing in the near future. So he's the guy I would take first off the board. In fact, in a non-Superflex league, he's the first player I'd take off the board altogether. You're talking about a guy who's going to be good for a lot of years to come. Still only 24 years old, so you're going to get another at least probably 8 to 10 years out of him. That's fantastic value in Dynasty. Just behind him, Justin Jefferson. He takes a slight decrease for me compared to last season. He was my number one going into last season. The reason for the decrease isn't anything that happened last season. He can't help the injury, and I don't think that's going to affect things moving forward. It's the quarterback situation. He goes from having a very aggressive quarterback who's going to be willing to use him to a guy who, well, I mean, we don't even know who it's going to be at this stage. If it's Sam Darnold, and it will be temporarily, I think, I mean, that's mediocre at best. And when JJ McCarthy comes in, he's more of a system quarterback, more of a game manager, or at least he has been previously. We don't really know how he's going to go in an offense where he's going to be expected to really try to air it out at times, and that's going to hurt Jefferson's production. Having said that, he's still an elite player. He's extremely talented. He's not going to go anywhere. It's just that his usage might drop a little bit. And that's why he drops below Lamb for me, but he's still in front of this number three guy, which is Amon-Ra St. Brown for me. Now, St. Brown is just so consistent. Again, they haven't brought in any competition. In Dynasty, even and definitely in redraft leagues, I'm definitely thinking about the next couple of years when we're trying to predict production. It's way too difficult to think too many years down the road. You just got to think, is this player in a good situation right now? And is he talented? They're the two things you've got to think about with wide receivers. We don't need to think about his age as much as with running backs because they're not going to fall off that cliff as quickly. And St. Brown, again, only 24 years old. He's going to be around for a while. In PPR, he's excellent because he gets so many targets. The only target competition really at the moment is Sam Laporta. Obviously, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get a few targets as well. And they're going to want to get Jameson Williams involved a little bit more. But they've lost a lot of their other lower wide receivers. And I think that means St. Brown is clearly going to be the number one guy, at least for the near future. He comes in just ahead of Jamar Chase, who is always in that top region. He had a bit of a struggle last year, wasn't playing at the best. The whole offense wasn't quite right. The fact that they've still got T. Higgins there means it's still going to be spread out with the targets, and that's a little bit of a concern. At least no Joe Mixon means the running backs might be getting few less targets, but I still don't know that you can really rely on Chase as being that elite dominant producer, but he is so talented that I have to rank him pretty high. If Joe Burrow can come back and play well, then he could rise up towards number 2 or number 3, depending on how things go. But the floor's a little bit lower than it was a season or two ago, because we've seen a couple of seasons in a row where he struggled to really produce. Heck, he's only got one top 5 season, and that was in his rookie season. So he needs to come back. He needs to play better. We need to see a little bit more from him before taking him any earlier than this. And he's pretty darn close to some of the rookies. And the first rookies here, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. We're talking about one of the best guys coming out of college in recent memory. We're talking about Calvin Johnson. We're talking about AJ Green. We're talking about that caliber of player as a prospect. Now, there have been plenty of prospects who've been high caliber players and have struggled. Players taken in the top 10 do bust. I recently put out an article on Razzball, and you can check it out over there, where I talked about the chances of a wide receiver hitting as a rookie. I won't go into it here too much, but realistically, if you're a top 10 player, your odds are pretty good, especially if you're a top 10 player with this level of talent. We're talking about one of the best guys that we're going to see this decade. So realistically, I'm happy to take him even higher than this, depending on your situation. If you're thinking this is a little bit of a rebuild for me, then I'd be willing to give up most players for Marvin Harrison Jr. That's how highly I think of him. There's very few knocks on him. Where the ceiling is, we don't know. He could be either just a very good pro, or he could be truly a top 5 option. And I'm willing to take the gamble that he is, because of that youth and because of that situation he's going into. Another guy going into a fantastic situation is the clear number 1 is Malik Neighbors. This is the guy in this offense. There's very little competition for targets for Daniel Jones to throw to. If Darren Waller retires, that's going to be even better. But Neighbors is going to be the guy they're going to go to, and they're going to go to him often. They don't have Saquon Barkley there to check down to anymore. They might be struggling at tight end. They haven't really brought in a lot of wide receiver competition. Who else is there but Malik Neighbors? He's going to be getting as many targets as he can handle. Now, we don't know what's going to be happening in the next year or two, but we do know that we're talking about a player with massive upside. He can take the ball to the end zone from anywhere on the field. So because he's so explosive, that gives him a good chance of succeeding in the league. There's so many things to like about him. I've talked about him in a couple of videos before, but he goes very high for me. There is a little bit of risk because of his character, because of the team he's going into, but I do think because he's got such a clear number 1 role that we could see him be very good for a long time. He knocks AJ Brown down, and this is nearly an age situation, and the fact that they brought Devonta Smith back with quite a big contract suggests to me that they don't really see Brown as the clear number 1. He was excellent last season for a while. He had that big stretch of 100-yard games in a row, but he really cooled off towards the end of the season. That makes me a little bit nervous. I do like the fact that the Eagles won't be able to use the tush push as much in the future, and that might mean a little bit more red zone opportunities for Brown. But the fact that Dallas Goedert comes back will probably take away from that just as much as he would have gained otherwise. Barkley coming in as a running back as well is going to take some target competition as well. So there's a lot to be nervous about, but there's also a lot of upside. We're talking about a top 5 player in the last 2 seasons, so you know what you're getting. You're talking about a slightly more experienced player, but still a guy who's going to be able to produce in the long term. Speaking of the long term, Puka Nacua came in and shocked everyone last year with the top 5 season, despite not even really playing every single game. He missed a game or 2 as well. He was excellent and still had Cooper Kupp there as target competition. It's absolutely crazy. Matthew Stafford is looking hopefully healthier this season, and that means that it's going to help Nacua even more. The problem's going to happen after Stafford retires, or at least they move on from him. That's probably only a season or 2 away. Who they bring in and how they run this offense is going to be a bit of a concern. But Nacua clearly has massive upside. He was really good in that first season. I'm happy to take him in the top 10 here. But you do have to understand there is a little bit of a risk with all that upside, and it wouldn't shock me at all if he drops down towards 20th odd in rankings next year, just because he can't do it again in his second season. Garrett Wilson's on the other end of things, where he's got all the talent in the world. As a talent projection, he's way higher than this. He's one of my favorite wide receivers purely as a talent. But realistically, he hasn't been able to put it together in the last couple of years. That's partly because the quarterback play has been terrible in New York, but also partly because he just hasn't been getting the target volume that we expect. They're running the ball a lot through Breece Hall. I really hope that with Aaron Rodgers back, that he gets a lot more targets. They brought in a rookie in Corley. They brought in Mike Williams, who may or may not be healthy. It's hard to know exactly what to expect from those guys and how that's going to affect Wilson. I'm a bit nervous, but you've got to bank on the talent. And realistically, that makes him a top 10 option. That will continue to make him a top 10 option until we see his actual play fall off rather than his production. Tyreek Hill, on the other hand, has been fantastic for a long time now. 3 second-place finishes in the last 4 years. But we're talking about a guy who's nearly 30. He's made it clear in a number of interviews that he's thinking of retiring in the next couple of years. That makes him very risky. Having said that, if you're in a situation where you're trying to win now, go out and get Hill and get him to win you a title or two, then you can rebuild from there. He's a guy that you really only want on your team if you're in your win now window. If not, sell him high while he still has a little bit of value, because it might not be long before he's gone altogether. He's also that type of player, because he relies on his speed so much, that could just fall off a cliff suddenly because the wrong injury happens, and he has been pretty injury-free of late, or simply because his speed fades, because speed does fall off at some point in time. So we'll see how that works out, but definitely a guy that you should be taking on if you're trying to win now. If you're trying to win now, he's probably a top 5 option for you. DJ Moore's a really hard one for me because he's so talented. He was top 10 last year, but he goes to a situation where Rome Odunze comes in, they bring in Keenan Allen, and they bring in a rookie quarterback, and generally rookie quarterbacks aren't good for their wide receivers. That makes me a little bit scared of him. He's also 26 years old, so he's not the youngest, even though he's still pretty young. So there's a lot to be a little bit nervous about, but there's a lot of talent. He's been able to produce pretty consistently. I wouldn't say that you can rely on a top 10 season this season, but I'd say in a season or two, you're probably going to find he's back to being a clear number 1 option, especially if they can get this offense a little bit more pass heavy. The concern here is how many mouths there are to feed. He's a guy that I will probably be considering dropping down in the future, depending on how this all falls out. But at the moment, he just feels to me like there is still a lot of upside if he is the clear number 1 option in this offense. And this could be a really explosive, high-scoring offense. Chris Olave has not been able to put it together at all. 25th and 20th is mediocre for a guy with his talent, especially with how little target competition he's had. Admittedly, Derek Carr hasn't been healthy the whole time, and they do use an annoying amount of Taysom Hill in the run game. But there's not a lot of competition here. You don't have Michael Thomas there anymore. Their number 2 is Rashid Shaheed, who's an undrafted free agent. So realistically, we're talking about a guy without a lot of competition. Juwan Johnson is still the tight end. They haven't really brought in a lot of true competition for him. They brought in Bub Means in, the 5th or 6th round. So we're not talking about a situation where there's a lot of guys that are going to come in and take targets from him. That means the upside's there. I'm banking on the talent. I'm banking on the upside in that same situation as Garrett Wilson. But unlike Garrett Wilson, who at least definitely gets Aaron Rodgers for the next season or two, we're talking about a situation where he's still getting Derek Carr and potentially turning it over to a rookie in Spencer Rattler. So there's a lot of concerns there, but there's definitely a lot of upside. You've still got to take the talent, because no matter what happens, he's still only very young, and he's going to remain that talented, and he's going to move to a different situation at some point, or this is going to adjust into a situation that's a little bit more beneficial for him. Rome Odunze is my 3rd rookie off the board, and he's the clear 3rd rookie, but he's also a clear top 3 rookies. Okay, these guys are way above the other rookies in this draft, and he's a guy that I'm very interested in taking if you're not trying to win right now. Unlike Harrison and Neighbors, who are going to produce straight away, Odunze has all the talent in the world, but he's clearly the wide receiver 3 at the moment. Keenan Allen is spectacularly good, and I think he's underrated by most people. And we've seen how good DJ Moore has been. They've still got Cole Kmet. They've brought in Gerald Everett. DeAndre Swift is a perfectly good pass-catching running back. That's a lot of targets, and Caleb Williams likes to use his legs occasionally. You're not going to get a lot of targets for Odunze, so I'm a little bit nervous about him for that reason. But as a long-term prospect, he is so projectable. He's so safe, excellent character. The only concern really is separation issues, and is that going to translate over to the NFL? I don't think it will. I think he'll be absolutely fine. He's so good at the contested catch that even if he can't separate, he still should be able to produce even against NFL cornerbacks. But because there's more risk and because you're going to have to wait a little bit for him, that's why he's a little bit lower for me than the other top rookies. Brandon Ayuk drops a little bit for me. I don't know how much of his production is due to the high-powered offense that he's been in and how much it is due to his talent. I think it's probably mostly his talent, but especially because he's competing against Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey. I mean, you have to fight for your targets in that situation. He's done a good job of that now that he's gotten out of the doghouse after a season or so. Finished top 12 last season, but we don't know if he's going to be traded in the next year or so. They bring in Ricky Pearsall. That means something. So I don't know if he's out the door. I don't know if Deebo Samuel's out the door, but it makes me a little bit nervous because we don't know where he's going. And I don't know that he's got that league-winning talent to really take you over the edge. The upside's lacking as well. Plus, if he goes to another team, I mean, we don't know how he's going to produce outside this very fantasy-friendly system. That makes me nervous, but the upside is at least solid of getting a guy who could be in the realm of the top 10 player moving forward. Michael Pittman's another guy that makes me quite nervous. Had a good finish last year, but ultimately they bring in Adonai Mitchell. We don't know how he's going to produce long-term with Anthony Richardson. I feel like probably he's going to go quite well, but Mitchell coming in is a little bit of concern because he is so talented. He has the ability to be the number one player or to be a total bust. Pittman, they've paid up, which is a good sign, but I'm not convinced he's the clear number one long-term. But if he is, there's a lot of upside here. This offense could go less pass heavy. And if they do, and if they can use Richardson a little bit more effectively, this could turn into a very good point scoring offense. And that'll be really good for the number one receiver. I feel like that's probably Pittman. So I'm willing to take a shot on him. I've definitely bought some shares around the place, and I'm not buying them cheap. I'm willing to pay up for a guy that I believe in, that I think is really talented, and I think could be good for the next 6, 7, 8 years in an offense that's on the way up. Devontae Smith stays in a really good offense after being pretty solid the last couple of years without being amazing. It's a bit disappointing that he's the clear number 2, given how talented he is. Really liked him coming out of college. Thought he had a lot of upside in that first season, and yet he's had a lot of his targets go to A.J. Brown, which makes sense because A.J. Brown is excellent as well. The fact that that's happening, and we also have Jalen Hurts running the ball a lot, is a little bit nerve-wracking for Devonta Smith owners. The fact that he re-signs is probably a good sign because this is a high-powered offense, but kind of would have been nice to see him go to an offense where he could be the number one option and see what he can do. I feel like he could probably be very good in that situation. But he's hanging around for a couple of years. For that reason, he's down to 16 for me. But you've got to bank on the talent. We're talking about a really talented receiver. Got to rely on that talent to make it happen. DK Metcalf, I mean, he's surprised a lot of people, but he's been very, very good for the last 4 years or so. Whether his play will translate across as he starts to age is my main concern. He's someone who needs a lot of power and size and speed, and I feel like if he just loses a step, he's going to lose a couple of the most important parts of his game. I'm also not sure that Geno Smith's really the guy to make it work with him. Plus, Jackson Smith and Jigba coming in is a bit pesky as well. Tyler Lockett's still not going anywhere. So I'm not really sure that you can rely on him to be an excellent receiver long term, but I at least feel like there's plenty of upside here. We've seen the production consistently. We've seen him stay injury free. They're all good signs. For that reason, he's a top 20 guy for me, kind of in the same region as the Devonta Smiths and the other guys like this. Michael Pittman's similar to him as well. I could take these guys in any order. It really depends on how win now you are and how much risk you're willing to take. I feel like Metcalf's not a guy that's going to win the league for you, but he's definitely going to be a good, solid producer. And if he's your wide receiver too, you're in a pretty darn good situation. Drake London's been disappointing the first 2 seasons, but I think we can agree that this is at least in part to Arthur Smith and what's been going on over there. You have to feel like bringing in a new coach, even though Raheem Morris isn't that special, is going to be a good sign. Kirk Cousins is someone who's usually excellent for the fantasy production of his wide receivers. I hope that's the case here. And when Michael Penix comes, I think that probably is going to be a situation that's good for London as well. He's the clear number 1 option. I don't believe that Darnell Mooney or Rondale Moore is going to really give him any issues. Kyle Pitts is going to be heavily involved, and I expect we'll see a lot of Bijan Robinson. But if it's filtering through those 3 guys, I feel like that's got to be a good sign for all 3, and it's especially good for London. I don't think this defense is so good that it can keep the other team from scoring. For that reason, they're going to have to keep scoring to chase games. They could be in some pretty high-scoring games this year. So I like what could happen here with London, even though the whole situation of getting Penix still makes absolutely no sense. Now, here's my 4th rookie, and I'm very much away from consensus with this. Most people have Keon Coleman down as 7 or 8. I don't agree. I really like the talent. I like what he did in college with FSU. I feel like there's a lot of good things about this situation. He basically is taking over from Stephon Diggs, who's been the clear number one in that offense. If he can become the clear number one in that offense, and that's a big if, then this could be very good for him. The Bills were clearly willing to trade back for him, which is usually not the greatest sign, but it could probably just mean that they were a couple of wide receivers they were happy with, and they were happy to trade down until there was only one left, and Coleman was clearly one of those. I think it probably means that, and if that's the case, that means they see him as on par with Worthy and with Leggett, Pearsall, those guys. At least probably Leggett, I think, was probably the other guy they'd be looking at. So that's probably a really good sign. He goes into a fantastic situation. We've seen how good this offense can be. The fact that they've got two good pass catching tight ends, and they've also brought in Curtis Samuel, who I think could actually be pretty good this year. Plus, Khalil Shakir is a good deep target. I mean, that's a lot to think about. But Keon Coleman is the alpha X style receiver. The upside is there. And that's kind of what I'm shooting for here. There is so much upside. He is a guy who could be excellent for the next 10 plus years. Jalen Waddle drops for a little bit for me, and that's a little bit annoying to me. He is so talented, but that offense is just going through Tyreek Hill to a crazy extent at the moment. Plus, their running backs are so heavily involved, and it makes me nervous about what we can expect from them moving forward. They also bring in Jonnu Smith, who I think is going to be a little bit more involved than Durham Smythe was. It wouldn't be hard. So I think there's a lot to worry about here. I don't know that there's really a third wide receiver who's true competition for them outside Odell Beckham Jr. for the next season or so. And even then, we haven't really seen Beckham get massively involved. We haven't even seen him on the field for over half the snaps when he was with Baltimore. So I'm not overly concerned about the Beckham situation. I'm more concerned about how much they're going to run the ball and how little they're going to use Waddle and how little he's going to be used in the red zone because they run it so effectively. Having said that, still so much talent, still a good option, but that drop off last season really has me scared. And that's why I've dropped him down a lot more than a lot of the other guys, because it's harder to project him as being consistently solid given the game plan that the Dolphins have been using recently. Nico Collins is another scary one. He looked really good last season, but there is so much competition for targets. There looked like there was a fair bit of competition for targets when you just had Robert Woods to worry about and Noah Brown. Now you bring in Stephon Diggs, and admittedly, Stephon Diggs is clearly not the Stephon Diggs that we're used to, but he's still a very talented player. Plus, Tank Dell looked very good in his rookie season as well. So I think Nico Collins is probably the number one guy, but he's a guy I've been moving down even since I did these rankings. He was in the top 20 for me, and I've moved him down to 21. He might even go a little bit further depending on what we hear in that offense. The idea of, I believe it was CJ Stroud coming out and saying Tank Dell to him is the guy he'd have in his fantasy lineups if he was making a fantasy lineup. That's a little bit scary. It could mean absolutely nothing as well. It could just be that they're mates. It could be that it's a shout out to him. It could be because he's younger. Who knows? But it's enough to have you a little bit nervous about Nico Collins. The upside is clearly there, but he's really only done it for one season, and I need to see a little bit more of him before making him higher. Having said that, so much upside in this offense that's been looking good for a long time. Hasn't been looking for a long time and finally did this season. I think that's probably a really good sign. We just need to see him do it again before we can start feeling really good about him. T. Higgins is another guy who I'm a little bit nervous about. Same as that Jalen Waddle situation. He, Waddle, and Smith, I was worried about all last season. It's hard to be the number 2 receiver in your team and produce consistently. We saw them all do it last season, then they all took a step back this season. I think that makes perfect sense. It's really hard to be that number 2 guy. T. Higgins comes back on a franchise tag. Does he move on long term? What's that going to look like? We don't really know. And for that reason, I do at least have some hope that things could work out. But I don't think he's that same high talent stud type as a Jalen Waddle or a Devonta Smith. He just does a really good job in the role that he's given in this offense. That's why he's a little bit lower for me, but he is still a good quality player. But you are talking about a guy that you want as your wide receiver too. He's probably not going to be that main guy, at least while he's in Cincy. Another rookie comes off the board with Xavier Worthy, and realistically, you could have him a couple of places higher than this. I don't think that would be crazy. Very talented guy, very fast. We know that he set a record for the 40, but he also plays fast as well, which is a good side. Not tiny. We're not talking about Tyreek Hill. We're talking about a little bit more size, which means he could be that number 1 receiver. We don't know what's happening with Rashee Rice. I think it might be a little bit overblown, everything that's happening. He probably will get a suspension, and deservedly so. But I do know that he probably comes back and plays at least somewhat in the next season or two. He will have a little bit of time off, I think, but he's still going to play. And then long term, there's no reason to think that he's going to be out of the league. He's still going to keep playing. So for that reason, it's not like this is a good long-term situation for Worthy, but Worthy has that time and that opportunity to become the number one guy. I don't think Rice was so good that you can't think that Worthy can't displace him. So for that reason, I have some hope for Worthy. Marquise Brown coming in makes me a little bit nervous, but he can't even stay healthy, and he hasn't looked fantastic the last season or two. So I have faith that Worthy's going to be good. I'm just not willing to take him as high as someone like Coleman, who just has such an easier path to a lot of targets. George Pickens, this is more situational. Now, to be fair, did finish 22nd last season, but it was very much big play, touchdown related. Deontay Johnson's gone, though, and he was the main guy there. He was getting a lot of targets. They have brought in Roman Wilson. I like Roman Wilson a lot, but he's going to take time to settle in and get better. That's what always happens with the Steelers. The first season is a little bit of a slow burn, and then they start to get going and they start to look really good. But even if Wilson looks really good, there's really only two pass catchers here. The running backs will pass catch a little bit. They'll be okay. Pat Frymuth hasn't looked like he's done very much. We're talking about Pickens and Wilson and really not anybody else. I don't really believe in the depth that they've got. They obviously brought in Van Jefferson. They brought in Quez Watkins. We're talking about blocking guys. We're talking about guys who are going to be running empty routes. We're not talking about actual true competition. If they pass the ball a little bit more, and I think they'll probably have to under Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, that can only be good for George Pickens. The problem is Wilson holds the ball a little bit too long in the pocket. Whether the O-line can hold up or not is a question, but we know that Pickens is going to go deep, and that means that if Wilson gives him time, he's going to be able to use him. So I like the upside here. He's also a really young guy, was explosive in college, had some injury issues and behavioral issues. He seems to have transitioned a lot better in the last season, and I think there's a lot of hope and upside here. He's someone I can imagine rising. Tank Dell, another guy could definitely rise. Had some issues last season with injuries, but looked excellent when he was out on the field. How he's going to be used in relation to Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs is a real concern, but I do expect that he's going to be very good. I talked earlier about how CJ Stroud sees him as one of his top producers from a fantasy perspective. Read into that what you may. That sort of thing often needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but talking about a really talented guy, I know he was taken later in day two, but he's still a guy who I expect is going to produce. He has that upside. I do like the situation. I wasn't very high on him at the start of last season. I was wrong. He looked fantastic. I think there is definitely a lot of potential here, but there's also plenty of risk because of the situation he's going into. Zay Flowers is another one who comes with some risk, but this is more based on the offense. They have been trying to get some wide receivers around Lamar Jackson for a long time. Flowers was able to boom, but no one else could really make it happen. And they haven't really brought in enough competition during the offseason. They've lost Beckham. They've brought in Tez Walker, but I'm not sure that he's really going to be the guy. We're probably going to see a big, messy mix of him, Bateman, and Aguilar again, but Flowers is going to remain the main guy. How productive that is? Well, I think he probably finishes higher than 26th in the next couple of seasons. The problem is I think he's probably capped there. I think thinking about a guy who's probably going to be pretty safe and reliable because he is the clear number one option, but Mark Andrews is back. They've still got Likely. They're going to run the ball a lot. So it's hard to rely on him as being a clear stud number one option, even though he is the clear best number one wide receiver. For that reason, he's a little bit lower down to me, even though he's only a second-year wide receiver. So plenty of upside here, but a lot of risk based on that situation as to how high he can get. So he's going to be somewhere in this region. He's a little bit capped, but I can't see him being a lot higher. So if you're going to pay up for a player like that, you kind of want a little bit more upside than that. Deebo Samuel is another guy who really concerning for me. Looked good at times when Christian McCaffrey was out, but with McCaffrey healthy, we just haven't been able to see him consistently produce. Brandon Ayuk out of the doghouse now. It's hard to really know what to expect from Samuel. He's getting a little bit older. Is he going to be traded? We don't know exactly what's happening there. Plus, Ricky Pearsall comes in. There's so much risk, and that's very scary for me with Deebo. He's someone that I could see falling down my rankings more so than going in the other direction. He's not someone I'll be going out of my way to trade for. I'd put it that way. There might be some people that are panicking a little bit about Pearsall coming in. If you can get him cheap, fantastic. Go for it. The upside's still there. We're talking about a guy who was a top 3 receiver a couple of seasons ago, but you've got to understand that you're not wanting to pay up for him. Brian Thomas is another rookie. I don't love the situation going to Jacksonville. We haven't really seen a clear path to him to be the number one. I think Christian Kirk's still that number one. I think he probably goes into that Calvin Ridley role, and that was pretty productive last season, but there's a lot of downside with Thomas. He's got very wooden hands. It's hard to know exactly how he's going to adjust. Minor character issues there, but very explosive, fast. He's going to do some good things when he's out in the field. He's just also going to make some weird mistakes. How that ends up transitioning into the league, we're going to have to wait and see. The situation is the thing that scares me most, though, with Kirk there and also bringing in Gabe Davis. I do like the fact a lot that they have gotten rid of Zay Jones, and that's made me think about moving him up slightly, but I think I'm pretty comfortable with him in this range, maybe close to moving past Deebo Samuel. Jordan Addison's another guy, one that I've thought about moving up, but the quarterback situation scares me a lot, and the fact that he's still clearly behind Justin Jefferson. Obviously had some good games last season when Jefferson wasn't out there, but with Jefferson healthy, he clearly takes a step back, and Kirk Cousins not being there is the biggest concern for me. When Kirk Cousins were there, he looked excellent. Without Kirk Cousins, he looked okay. Obviously could get that second-year boost, but we've seen quite a few guys have good rookie seasons then fall off a little bit because the situation wasn't quite right. I can imagine that happening with Addison. Still pretty young, still a first-round receiver from the 2023 draft. That's a good sign, but there's a lot to be nervous about. There's a lot of people who tell you to take him a lot higher than this because the upside's so good, but I don't want to pay for that upside. He's still the clear number 2 receiver in an offense that might not be particularly pass-heavy under JJ McCarthy. That makes me a little bit concerned. Mike Evans is the picture of reliability. We're talking about a guy who just puts 1,000-yard season after 1,000-yard season. You can see his last 5 fantasy finishes, always a top 12 receiver, finds a way to stay healthy. Every time we can him out, he just manages to produce. And last season, he was somehow even better with Baker Mayfield of all people. So it doesn't matter who his quarterback is, doesn't matter what his situation is, he will produce. Love Mike Evans, but he's in his 30s. For that reason, I'm ranking him in the 30s as well. I think that if you're in a win now situation, I'd be going out of my way to get Mike Evans because he's probably going to help you in the next season or two, but not much past that. So for that reason, can't rank him any higher, but love him if you're in a win now situation. Go out, get him, use him for a couple of seasons, and then you'll be done and you can rebuild. Devontae Adams, another guy that you can take if you're in a win now situation. 3 fantastic seasons in a row. Moving to Vegas wasn't the greatest thing for him. We don't know exactly what's going on there with the quarterback situation. That's a little bit scary, but there's a lot to feel good about with Adams in the fact that he's the clear top receiver. There's not really a lot of competition of any type around him except Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers coming in is a little bit of a concern, but I still think Adams is going to get enough targets to be relied on. I think next season, we're probably talking about a guy who's top 15 maybe receiver. And I think at this range, if you're trying to win now, that's about where you should value him. Having said that, if you're in any sort of a rebuild or you're not thinking you're winning at this very moment or you don't think you're a good chance of winning at the moment, probably sell him while the name value is still pretty high because it is going to fall off. If you can convince someone, hey, he was still a top 12 receiver last season, you might be able to sell him for a good amount, might be able to get a first-round pick or something out of him. I personally wouldn't pay a first-round pick, but you might find some people in your league who are willing to give you one at the back end of the first round because they want to keep winning. That's the sort of thing I'd be looking to do, especially if he has a good start to the season. Amari Cooper's another guy you really want to be winning if you're going to use him. He's a guy who just manages to stay healthy and produce consistently, hasn't had many bad seasons, but also hasn't had many really good seasons. For a guy who was a top 10 pick, you usually expect to see some real boom seasons, but instead he's just been really consistent, has been in some situations where he's had a little bit of target competition. That's going to grow this year. Obviously, they've brought in Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore's still there, but Cooper's the clear number 1 guy, and there's not really any argument with that. We also don't know if Nick Chubb's going to be back, but hopefully Deshaun Watson will be, and hopefully he'll be better because he wasn't particularly good last season. Cooper looked really good with Joe Flacco. If you look good with Joe Flacco, you can probably look good with most people, even though Flacco was unexpectedly good. I like Cooper in that win now situation as well. There's a lot of players in this range who are going to help you now, and you should only really be targeting them if you're trying to win now. Jaden Reed's someone that makes me really nervous. Scored a lot of touchdowns last season, and I think that was part of the reason for his top 30 finish. I don't think he had a legit top 30 finish, but he's kind of turning into that top option in Green Bay. Realistically, his snap count was actually really low last season at times. He was losing nearly half of his snaps to Dontavion Wicks, and also a few to Bo Melton and things like that, which was really strange. He was really only out there 56% of the time, but he was super productive when he was there. You have to feel like they can expand his route tree over the offseason and they're going to use him a lot more. So for that reason, Jaden Reed's a guy I feel pretty good about. I would be happy to use him in fantasy. I'd be happy to sell him as well if there are people who are willing to pay up for him. And I'd also be happy to buy him if there's people who just don't really see the value. It's really hard to know how other people in your league are going to value him, because I've seen situations where people are talking about dropping him, which is truly insane. But I've also seen situations of people wanting a haul for him because of how good he looked towards the end of last season. So I would be scoping out how your league mates feel about him if you're thinking of selling him, seeing if there's anyone who values him highly. And I'd also be scoping out the owner to see if he's willing to sell him cheap, because he's a kind of guy that you might be able to get a weird value out of from someone else. Jackson Smith-Njigba, I mean, this is pretty low for him, and I do feel a bit weird about that, but he really didn't look great last season. He looked okay. He started to come on towards the end of the year, but he's not going to be the number one anytime in the near future. This is clearly DK Metcalf still. Tyler Lockett's still there. It's just really ugly. It's hard to rank a receiver high when they're not going to produce in the coming season. But we're talking about a guy who's very young. I have hope for him. I do like the talent. I did consider putting him quite a bit higher. But realistically for me, I think more people are going to be trying to win now than are trying to rebuild. And for that reason, I put him behind the win now guys, because you need to be in a true rebuild to really get value out of him. I think most people, even people who are thinking I might want to win next season, are probably better off with a different player. I think you need to be thinking a couple of years down the track if you're going to get true value for JSN. Lad McConkey is an interesting one. He goes into a situation where there's three relatively equally talented wide receivers, but they're nowhere near as good as the Jackson Smith-Njigba situation. Josh Palmer, very good third receiver, not a great number one receiver. Quinn Johnston / TJ Chark, whoever the other wide receiver is, has been disappointing. Both of them have been. Johnston, I mean, realistically, he's probably got this coming off season and start of the season to really show he can turn it around, or he's heading for bust territory. We know how that can look for guys like N'Keal Harry, where you really don't get that many chances before people are willing to give up on you. Those guys that have separation issues, if you can't separate, it's not going to work in the NFL, and that makes me very nervous about Johnston. DJ Chark, really more of a deep threat at this stage. So I think McConkey's probably going to be that main guy who kind of takes over from Keenan Allen. He's not a true like-for-like replacement, doesn't quite have that same size. He's also not actually a true slot receiver. A lot of people have pegged him as a slot receiver. He spent most of his time on the outside in college. So for that reason, it's hard to know exactly how they're going to use him, but he is probably going to be that underneath guy at least. That's usually good for PPR. That's usually a lot of targets. So there is some upside there. I'd be happy to take him a little bit earlier than this in certain situations, but I do feel like his ceiling is a little bit capped in this offense, where I expect them to run quite a lot, and that makes me pretty nervous. That's why I haven't got him higher than this. Rasheed Rice is also a guy with a lot of reasons to be nervous. Suspension, not great. Xavier Worthy coming in, not great. Marquise Brown coming in, not great. A whole lot of reasons to be a little bit concerned. I think some of the suspension concerns are a little bit overblown. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve one. I'm saying the effect it's likely to have on fantasy football is a little bit lower than some people are thinking. But I also think that last season's, I wouldn't call it a breakout, but last season's good wide receiver 2 style finish was a little bit of a fluke, and I think it's probably going to come back to earth a little bit. I think he lacks the true upside of a lot of guys. as much as I love the Chiefs, as you know, literally have the jersey in the background, Patrick Mahomes does spread the ball around a lot, and Travis Kelce just signed for two more years. So there really isn't a top pass catching role there available. And when there is, I think it's probably going to be Xavier Worthy. So it's hard to know how Rice fits in. He profiled as a guy who was more of a number two receiver when he came out last year. And I was a little bit surprised how it ended up working out. But I think he probably slides back into that second wide receiver role again. Christian Kirk, this is more of an age issue and an inability to stay healthy issue. I talked about Brian Thomas probably being the number two receiver. I do think Kirk's probably the guy. At the start of last season, he looked absolutely fantastic before Ridley started to take over. He just can't stay healthy. He needs to be able to stay healthy to make it work. We're seeing when he's healthy, he can produce at wide receiver 2 levels, and I think he probably can for another couple of seasons. But I feel like he probably caps out then. I think there's probably a situation where it's a couple of seasons and then he kind of fades away, and that's why I've got him ranked quite a bit lower. Xavier Legette, I mean, this is my favorite prospect coming out of college. Not so much because I think he's an unbelievable player. He's good. He's got some separation issues, got some route running issues, but he is very talented, plays way bigger than they actually is, very strong. But I just love watching him play. He's so entertaining to watch, makes some special catches, and looks great when he's got the ball in his hand. He looks like a running back at times. I just love watching him play. I had him in college fantasy, so I've got a soft spot for him. But I do have to rank him a little bit lower because he goes to the Panthers. That's an ugly situation. Bryce Young hasn't looked particularly good. I do think there's hope that he could sort it out in his second season. In the old days, we always used to give quarterbacks a couple of seasons to sort themselves out. I think we still need to do that. But I do think that this Panthers offense in general is just a little bit of a mess. I think Tep is not a very good owner. I think he gets too involved, and it makes it very difficult for the coaches to do their jobs well. For that reason, I'm a little bit concerned. They just brought in a new running back as well. They brought in tight end help as well. There's a lot of reasons to think that maybe they've got so many new weapons, not all of them are going to be heavily involved. And Deontay Johnson is going to be the clear number one guy here. So how that works for Legette, who comes out as a slightly older rookie, I don't know. I do like him, but not as much as a lot of the other guys going around. Jalen Polk is another guy I feel pretty nervous about. Very talented player, but going to New England is not a good situation. You do have to take those things into account, especially with rookies, because they're going to be there for the next 4 to 5 years at least. 5 years probably for Legette, 4 years with Polk because he's a second-round player. I do think he's got the talent of a lot of the guys taken just ahead of him, but it's hard to know what to expect from this offense. If they give it to Drake May quite early, and if he looks good and he's able to air the ball out a little bit, Polk could be excellent. We've seen guys like Jacoby Myers and Kendrick Bourne have some good games for the Patriots in the last couple of years, but it's generally been those undrafted guys rather than their top stars that have succeeded in New England. No Bill Belichick there anymore, so you do have to take that into account that things are going to look a little bit different, but I don't think they're going to look that different. We're still talking about a defensive-minded coach. That makes me a little bit concerned about Polk, even though I think the talent's enough to take a risk on him if you can get him for the right price. Terry McLaurin has been way better than expected coming out of college, but ultimately he's still a deep speed guy. But he's the number one guy in this offense. They don't really have anything else. I think probably they're going to pass their running backs quite a lot with Austin Eckler there. They don't really have a clear number one tight end there. They've kind of got Zach Ertz and the rookie coming in, Ben Sinnott. So, I mean, there's not a lot of competition there. Jahan Dotson was really disappointing. He needs to step things up as a former number one pick. Luke McCaffrey's not true competition. I don't even know if he's going to win that third receiver spot. So you got to feel good about at least the opportunities for McLaurin, but he's a guy who's quite a bit older now. Older players are a little bit risky when they rely on their speed, and McLaurin does as a deep threat. Are they going to pass the ball deep? I mean, Jaden Daniels is pretty accurate and he has a good deep ball, so I do like that aspect of things, but I'm very concerned about McLaurin for a number of those other reasons. Adonai Mitchell is a guy that with a massive amount of upside and a really, really, really low floor. The reason he dropped, even though he had first-round talent, was that teams were concerned about his character, and they're also concerned about the way that he manages his diabetes. I've talked about that quite a lot. We believe that that's the news coming out. That's courtesy of World Football, who tends to nail these sort of why they drop things. So for that reason, I've got Mitchell dropping a little bit as well. But the upside's there. And in a lot of your leagues, you will see him drop because he was drafted so much later than everyone else. If your team doesn't really understand a lot about the rookies coming out, they're probably going to let Mitchell fall. And in that case, you should snap him up when the value's right. But I think in a lot of leagues, he's going to be taken a little bit too early because people see the talent, people see him going into that situation. People who watch college football will know that he deserved to be a first-round prospect. They're not going to take into account the risk that's going to come with a guy who may just flame out of the league entirely. And we've seen guys that are drafted in this later second-round range. And again, check out the article on Razzball where I talked about how they have a far higher bust probability. They're just as likely to succeed, but the chances of being total duds is a lot higher. And that makes me very concerned about Mitchell for that reason. That's why he's a little bit lower. Ricky Pearsall's also a little bit low, but this is more down to the situation. I'm a little bit concerned confused why he was a first-round player. I don't really see the talent, but clearly the 49ers decided he's the right player for their situation. I don't really understand what he's going to do here. John Jennings is probably still the blocking back. So unless Debo or Ayuk moves on quite soon, Pearsall's mostly going to be uninvolved. And that's a little bit of a concern for a guy that you're drafting as a 23-year-old rookie. So don't love this whole situation. He's not a guy I'm going out of my way to get. And he's someone that I'll probably just let other people draft. If he really falls, I'll take a shot because there's clearly upside. If you lose Ayuk or Debo, all of a sudden you're talking about one of the guys who's one of the four, and there's only ever four weapons in this very high-powered 49ers offense. Keenan Allen has been fantastic for so many years. I've got Keenan Allen in so many of my Dynasty leagues. I have him everywhere, and he was fantastic last season, but he's struggling to stay healthy now, and I think that's going to continue happening as he gets older. He goes into a situation where there's a lot of target competition. If you're trying to win now, I mean, grabbing Allen as a guy who might still be really good for another season or so is a good idea. But unless you're planning on challenging at this very moment, right now, you have one of the best teams, sell Allen off for a second-round pick or something along those lines. If you can't get a second-round pick right now, wait until the season starts and he looks pretty darn good. He'll have a boom game somewhere and then sell him there. Because this is the kind of player that is going to fall off a cliff really soon and he'll have zero value very soon. It's hard to believe Chris Godwin's only 27 years old. It feels like he's been around for so long. I think it was because he had that massive breakout season when he was young, where he finished second and he missed a couple of games as well. Dropped off with a lot of injuries, but has looked good the last couple of seasons. Still battled a few injuries, but managed to play most of the games last season. He really did look like he'd lost a bit of a step, and that's why I've got him ranked a little bit lower than most. When someone who's 3 years older than you in Mike Evans and not as explosive, but more of a big-bodied receiver, looks like the more explosive player, that's a little bit of a concern. To be fair, there's not a lot of target competition there. Jalen McMillan comes in, but they needed a third guy anyway, and I feel like that's what McMillan's going to be, even though he comes in as a day two prospect. I do feel like Godwin, though, has enough concerns about him that for me, he's falling a lot. I feel like he could have another struggle season, or he could really bounce back. Because there's that upside, he's someone you can go for if you're trying to win now, because he could give you a really good season. I wouldn't be going out of my way to get him, though, because whoever's got him is probably going to be a little bit attached to their name value, despite the poor last season. This is going to seem very low for Stephon Diggs, but I just don't buy it. He looks really poor at the end of last season. He goes into a really ugly situation. I mean, he's been fantastic for 4 straight seasons in the top 10. That's really impressive. But I think this is probably about it. I feel like he's starting to fall off. He's also a major character concern. It wouldn't surprise me if he just totally gets cooled out because it's not working in their culture in that dressing room. I think he's going to really struggle with not being the clear alpha there. I think the fact that Nico Collins and Tank Dell are probably going to get more targets, and they're still going to use Dalton Schultz, and they're still going to run the ball as well. I mean, there's a lot of things to worry about with Diggs there. For that reason, I'm trying to sell off all my Diggs shares as quickly as I can. I managed to get a very late first rounder for him recently. I think that was pretty darn good value, especially because it's a deep league where wide receivers are highly valued. If you can get any sort of first rounder for Diggs, I'm probably doing it, unless you're trying to win right now, because he might be at least okay for another couple of seasons. Cooper Kupp falls into that same situation where Injuries have really hurt him, and Puka Nacua coming in made it a little bit tougher for him. He's been a guy that we've thought of as being one of the best wide receivers in the league for a while now. Of course, he was literally the highest scoring wide receiver in 2021, but that's not the case anymore. He's a guy who's really falling off. You might be able to sell him for name recognition, but realistically, I'm very nervous about him. And that's why I've got him ranked so low. He's someone I'm trying to sell unless you're winning right now and you really need wide receiver depth. Get him very cheap if you target the right person. I personally would just prefer to not take him at all, or wait a game or two, see what happens. This is the other end of the scale. We're talking about a guy who's been very disappointing, but very talented. Came in with an injury, obviously hasn't been able to produce, but there's been a lot of talk out of the Lions that he's the new wide receiver too. Admittedly, being the wide receiver two at the Lions isn't the same as it is with most teams. They don't really use their wide receiver two a lot. They tend to move it around and mix it up a lot. So I still would be expecting a lot of guys like Khalif Raymond coming in and randomly getting very annoying targets. But Williams is going to be more involved, I expect. He's very explosive, very fast, good downfield. There's upside here. And I love the upside. And if I was rebuilding, he's a guy that I want to get my hands on because there is so much upside here. And you can point to his poor performances to try to get him cheap. If you can get him cheap, he's a guy I really want to get my hands on. He might even be available in some leagues because anyone who's looking at box scores is probably going to be fed up with him. Speaking of getting fed up with him, Calvin Ridley has been a guy who everyone gets fed up with in the change rooms. He's now moved to another new team. How he goes in Tennessee, we'll have to see. He's been very good when he's been out in the field and not suspended or unhealthy. But this isn't the sort of offense that's been particularly pass-heavy in the past. Having said that, they've clearly made some changes. They brought in DeAndre Hopkins. They bring in Calvin Ridley. They brought in Tyler Boyd. They still talk about Treylon Burks potentially being involved. So, I mean, there's a lot to like about this passing game. The bit I don't like, though, is the quarterback, Will Levis. It's really hard to love a situation where you've got a guy who rightly dropped to the second round, looked okay last season, but didn't look fantastic. He didn't feel like a guy who could sustain 4 wide receivers, and also a couple of good pass catching running backs in Tony Pollard and also in Tyjae Spears. So there's a lot to be nervous about for that reason, but I do still think that Ridley's a guy that you can use at least if you're in a win now mode. Courtland Sutton is a lot older than most people realize. Because he missed that whole season, it's easy to forget that his actual breakout was 5 years ago. And he hasn't been particularly good since then. He's still the nominal number one wide receiver in Denver, but I feel like this is going to be another one of those situations where a lot of different players are getting targets and a different player will be good each week. That's not a great situation to be in. That makes me very nervous. But there is still the potential he's going to be the number one option. We don't know who the quarterback's going to be. We don't know how valuable that's going to be, but I do think he's at least going to be involved. And for that reason, we're willing to take a pot shot on him very late on in drafts. This is starting to feel a little bit low for Roman Wilson. The more I talk about those other guys, I feel like if you're in anything but a real win now situation, Wilson's a guy I really like. I think he's probably this low for me because he's probably not going to produce much in his first season. Even though he likely goes into the wide receiver 2 role, I just don't know that he's quite in a situation where he's ready. And that's a bit concerning because he's a bit of an older prospect. We know the Steelers are really good at getting their day 2 and even day 3 guys like Antonio Brown, wide receivers to be very, very good. And I think Wilson could be the next one of those guys. It's just hard to really believe it given everything around him. It's a good role to go into because he is the wide receiver 2 and there's not really a lot of competition, but I don't really buy that he's got that upside of being a stud number 1 guy. That's why I like George Pickens so much more, because he at least profiles as a guy who could be the number 1 receiver. Joshua Palmer's another guy. Even though he's in a situation where he could be the number 1 receiver, I really do think he's a wide receiver 3 style player. We haven't really seen him produce as an alpha, even when his competition's been injured. He now has no competition. Everyone else is either a rookie in Ladd McConkey or a guy who's been a little bit of a bust like Quinton Johnston. So for that reason, Palmer has the opportunity to be the wide receiver 1. I don't think he will be. But the fact that he could be means there's at least a little bit of upside here. He's still pretty young, even though he's played 3 seasons. So there is a good reason to take him if you're interested. I wouldn't argue with anyone taking him later on in startup drafts, especially if you have a rebuilding team, you want to trade for him. I won't argue with you in that situation. He's just not a guy that I would personally be targeting. Same thing with Marquise Brown. He's been disappointing the last couple of seasons. Had one good season a couple of years ago, but realistically hasn't been able to stay healthy. Hasn't looked particularly good when he has been. To be fair, that offense has been a bit of a mess. He didn't get enough time with Kyler Murray to really get things going together either. We'll see if he can spark it with the Chiefs, but it feels to me as he's more of like a wide receiver 3 type who they're just going to get running a lot of routes to distract the defense. I don't think he's ever going to be the number 1 guy there. That's why he drops down so low for me. Christian Watson's another guy I'm very concerned about. A lot of injury issues. Looked fantastic when playing and healthy in his first season, but he's really struggled being healthy. I think Jaden Reed takes over a lot of his opportunities, but there's at least enough upside here. We're talking about a big guy who's pretty quick, scores a lot of touchdowns. If they can do that and he can make it work with Jordan Love, that'll be fantastic. But there's massive amount of risk as a guy who really has a good chance of totally busting. Deontay Johnson is way lower than you would expect for a guy who was a top 10 wide receiver a couple of seasons ago and is the number 1 guy on his team. Again, it's the Panthers. I do not even slightly believe in what the Panthers are doing there. They brought in a lot of good offensive players, and that's great. Bryce Young needs all the help he can get, but I don't think Johnson's going to be the target hog he's been in the past. He has just seemed to find a way of getting a lot of targets previously. I don't know that continues. I feel like we're going to see a lot more Xavier Legette. I feel like we're going to see a lot more of guys like Adam Thielen. He's not going anywhere. Jonathan Mingo's still going to get some opportunities. It's just a little bit of a mess. And that's why I've got Johnson a little bit lower than you might expect. He's also not as young as you think, and he had some injury issues last season. So there's a lot of reasons to steer away from him. But he's a guy you can take a shot on in a PPR league. If you're trying to win now and you just need a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 style guy, he's going to get a lot of targets and just kind of give you a little bit of maybe bye week support would be a good situation to have him in. This kind of your 4th wide receiver. DeAndre Hopkins, awkward situation in an offense where we don't know what's happening. I talked about the Titans earlier when I talked about, who was it? Calvin Ridley. I talked about Calvin Ridley. I talked about all the issues there. Same thing happens with Nook. He's been excellent for a long time. But the last few seasons, he struggled with injuries. And then, of course, he struggled with the play of his quarterback. Now, whether that changes next season, I don't know. I think it probably doesn't. And now he gets a lot more target competition. He's also a lot older, so you're probably only going to get another year or 2 out of him at best. Think about kind of what happened with Julio Jones, where all of a sudden he was barely involved. That sort of thing is what I could imagine happening with Hopkins. Kind of similar, maybe also to that Odell Beckham situation, even though Beckham's actually not that old comparatively. Just where you're no longer the number 1 option, you're no longer really fantasy relevant, even though you're still making some good plays. Jahan Dotson's been really disappointing, but there's still a lot of people out there who like him. I was able to trade him for a 2nd-round pick, for example, which I felt pretty happy about. I was in the same trade as Stephon Diggs one. Got a 1st, a 2nd, and a 3rd for Diggs and Dotson. I felt pretty good about that because even though Dotson is the number 2 in that offense, he's been so disappointing the last couple of seasons. He's falling into bust category, and that's so sad because he was a 1st-round pick. I think it was a little bit of a risk when they picked him, and he was a little bit of a reach when they picked him. And they've been known to do that. They did the same thing with Emmanuel Forbes, the Commanders. So it's hard to feel really good about him. It's hard to feel good about his situation with the rookie quarterback who likes to run the ball a lot, and with running backs who were going to be probably pretty heavily involved with both Robinson and Eckler. You still got McLaurin there. You got the young McCaffrey coming in. You got Ben Sinnott coming in. You still got Zach Ertz. There's a lot of names there, and they're all kind of equally mediocre. It's hard to see the offense being particularly good, but it's also hard to see Dotson being a clear, strong receiver and clearly heavily involved. That's why I've got him so low. I don't understand what the path's going to be. He'd have to really break out and look a lot better for him to be someone who can produce for you. Jermaine Burton is a guy who comes with a massive amount of risk, but he's got more upside than pretty much anyone else around. He was excellent at Bama, but massive character concern. Should have been a 1st-round pick. Instead falls well into the 3rd round, but goes into a really good situation. We know the Bengals don't shy away from taking guys with characteristics. Saw it with Joe Mixon, for example, and he turned out okay. So I can imagine him being good. He obviously joins Chase and Higgins, so he's the clear number 3, but Higgins could be gone very quickly. So if that's the case, then he could slide upwards. That's not to say he'll definitely be the number 2 guy. I wouldn't be surprised if Josivas gets involved a lot more, if Trenton Irwin also gets involved as a good blocking and just reliable wide receiver option. So I think the Bengals are taking a pot shot here on a guy who could replace Tyler Boyd. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. But late in drafts, and as a guy who you're just taking an upside shot on, I think it makes sense to have a go with Burton. Corley is an awkward situation because I think there's a lot less upside there than Burton, but he's probably more likely to succeed. Having said that, 3rd-round rookies have a far higher bust rate than 2nd-round guys. We're talking about over 50%. For that reason, and going into the situation where he's clearly behind Garrett Wilson, he has to compete with Mike Williams, assuming he's healthy. He has an aging Aaron Rodgers. There's a lot of reasons to think maybe this isn't going to work out, that he could end up being a guy who never really gets anything going. But there's upside there. He's a solid player. He's a player that a lot of people talked about potentially in the 2nd round. And potentially, if this wasn't such a strong wide receiver class, he would have been going in the 2nd round. And I think that should be taken into account. That's why I'm at least willing to take a shot on him. I think there's certainly upside there, but a lot less upside than a lot of the other guys going ahead of him. Jakobi Meyers is an undrafted player who's actually made a really good career out of himself, was very good with the Patriots, goes across to the Raiders, and was surprisingly heavily involved at times before starting to fall away at the end of last season. 3 straight top 32 finishes is actually really pretty darn good for a player who came from where he came from. So very happy for him as a guy, but I think probably his fantasy time is over. Those undrafted free agent guys who do actually strike, for the vast majority of the time, they have a couple of good seasons and then they fall away again. They're far more likely to have 1 or 2 good seasons and then disappear than players who were drafted in the top 3 rounds. So for that reason, I think you need to take that into account. Obviously, some guys will break that mold, thinking guys like Adam Thielen, people like that. But for the most part, guys like Myers are going to struggle. And for that reason, I don't really want him in fantasy. The upside isn't very high. Romeo Dobbs also has some upside capped. Admittedly, top 35 finish last season. That's pretty good. But Christian Watson should be back and healthy. We've seen that they want to get Wicks involved. Jaden Reed's surely going to have to be more involved because he looked so good on the oddly limited snaps that he got. Got a lot of touches, but not a lot of snaps. So I feel like that probably hurts Dobbs. He becomes that kind of wide receiver who's not really used as much kind of guy. So I could see him fading this year as he started to last year. For that reason, he goes a little bit lower for me. Didn't obviously bother making a full graphic for these guys because we're talking pretty deep in the league. Let's talk through a couple of guys. Gabe Davis, I mean, it's been disappointing for Buffalo for a while, so he drops down a long way for me. He's just a deep target these days. You can't really rely on him in fantasy. Jerry Jeudy needs to show something before I'm willing to take a shot on him in fantasy. He's been disappointing for a while now. He's got a whole lot of attitude issues which don't help, which is a shame because he's such a talented player, but I just don't see it working out. Same thing with Quentin Johnson. I liked him a lot coming out of college, but we all knew there were separation concerns, and he really wasn't able to put that to bed. We also knew there were drops issues, and they kept happening. So there's a lot of reasons to be very concerned about him, but he's got a little bit more upside than most of the guys in this range. So if you're looking for upside late drafts, I would take a shot on Johnston. Jalen McMillan goes in as the 3rd wide receiver in Tampa. That's not really worth a lot for the most part. We also don't know how what's going to happen with guys like Trey Palmer, for example. Russell Gage is at least gone. He should have been the number 3 wide receiver before he got injured. So, I mean, McMillan might turn out as a guy who's at least involved, and maybe he takes over from Evans and or Godwin as they move on. But I don't have a lot of faith in him. I think they probably go and get a proper stud guy when they want one. Troyce Franklin at least goes to his college quarterback in Bo Nix and joins him at the Broncos, but I'm not even sure he's going to start. Day 3 wide receivers, even though he's very early day 3 wide receiver, have a really low hit rate. And I know that the name looks good, but he wasn't actually that fantastic in college. I think they probably want to get Marvin Mims a little bit more involved. I wouldn't surprise me if we still see a little bit of Tim Patrick. They've obviously got Josh Reynolds in there as well. This is kind of what the Broncos do. They just bring in a whole lot of wide receivers. Even when they drafted Marvin Mims, they seemed to have a million, and then somehow they didn't have enough. So you just don't know what to expect from them. But I think that offense as a whole is going to be a mess. Curtis Samuel is a guy with a lot of upside at Buffalo, but a really low floor. I could see a situation where he's good for a year or two if it doesn't work out with Keon Coleman in particular, but I think realistically, probably he's a guy who you can't even use in fantasy. Luke McCaffrey, I think he was drafted too early. I don't think he's a true day 2 receiver. I think he should have gone in day 3, but he did go very late on day 2, so it's not egregious. I just don't see it happening. I mean, it's a good situation. There's not a lot of competition there. McLaurin's been disappointing. Dawson's been really disappointing. Gets a rookie quarterback, which isn't great because he runs a lot. I don't think that's going to be a high-value role. He might not even be a starter. Mike Williams, so many injury issues. He's getting older now. If he can be healthy and actually get out in the field, he could be really good with the Jets for a couple of seasons. So if you win now of all these guys, he and Tyler Lockett are the guys I'd be targeting. Tyler Lockett obviously has been good for a long time, starting to fade away, starting to show signs that it's not going to work out in the next season or two after an excellent career. Michael Wilson has been disappointing for Arizona. Kind of was the nominal number 1 receiver, and now Marvin Harrison comes in. They brought in Zay Jones, who I think is probably the true number 2. For that reason, Wilson has a really low floor. I think he's probably heading towards bust status, even though he wasn't drafted that early. I just don't see it really working for him, even though I do like the talent. There is enough to like about him. So he's getting some planes overhead, as you do. Josh Downs, I mean, Adonai Mitchell comes in. Michael Pittman's still there. Anthony Richardson's not going to throw the ball enough to sustain 3 wide receivers. And they've still got Alec Pierce. It's not a lot to see here. Same thing with Zay Jones. Aging, not really the same thing, but aging. Goes into an offense where he's not going to be used a particularly high amount. I think the fact that they let him go from Jacksonville shows you what they think of him. Kendrick Bourne seems to have some boom games, but he's hard to rely on in fantasy. And the New England offense is going to be a big mess. So it's hard to believe that he's going to be a guy that you can rely on long term. Rashid Shaheed, I just don't trust undrafted free agents. I know he's nominally their number 2 wide receiver, but I really don't see how that's going to work. They've got A.T. Perry there, who's technically their number 3. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of Cedric Wilson. I think we probably see a little bit of Bum Memes. I think those 4 guys probably just kind of make it work between them, and none of them are particularly good for fantasy. But Shaheed would be the guy to have. You're going to have one of those 4. I just really, really struggle with a guy who's a little bit older, undrafted free agents. Bad combination for me. Marvin Mims, I mean, he's young. They said they're going to use him, but coaches say random stuff all the time. I'm not sure I believe it. They've brought in so many guys. The offense is going to be a total mess. I don't think his talent set goes well with Bo Nix. I just don't see it working. Darnell Mooney looks good for a while at the Bears, but then they brought in some actual competition and suddenly he wasn't involved. He was way behind DJ Moore. He goes at least to an Atlanta team that's going to throw the ball, but I don't think they're throwing it to him. I think it's Bijan, Drake, London, and Kyle Pitts, and that's about it. We see a little bit of Mooney and Moore, but not much. Brandon Cooks, he's 30 now. I think he's starting to fade away. He's still a 3rd wide receiver, but I'm not particularly interested in him. Demario Douglas, another late round guy. It's really hard to believe that late round guys are really going to do anything much. They tend not to, even if they have the occasional good season. I think that probably happens here with Douglas. They brought in Polk. I'm not even sure that he's one of the starters. He might be, but it's hard to know how he compares to Bourne if Bourne is healthy. Obviously, they've still got Smith-Schuster there. They've still got Rager, and Baker comes in as a rookie. They've got Thornton. There's so many names there. I think it's just a big mess. Baker's not even on this list, by the way, because he's a day 3 wide receiver in a terrible offense. There's a lot of people who will tell you should consider him. Don't. Just don't. Khalil Shakir is a rare day 3 guy. At least he's an early day 3 guy who looks pretty solid, but realistically, Coleman's the guy. Curtis Samuel's the number 2. Shakir's going to be that deep threat. Unless there's some injuries ahead of him, I can't see him being particularly productive. And finally, Wan'Dale Robinson. It's just hard to believe in him. The injuries are a real concern for me. I can't see him being able to stay consistently healthy, but he is technically their wide receiver too. I think it's mostly neighbors, and I think they probably bring in someone else in the next year or two, or they just hit a full rebuild. I just don't really want to be part of that. So for that reason, Robinson is gone for me. And that's it. Thanks for joining me on a very deep dive into the wide receivers this year. Make sure you go to ffdfantasyfootball.com if you want to check out the rankings and just have them there in a list instead of having to listen through them all again. You can also hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down if you've got any questions, or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. I've been Ben Wasley. You've been watching the Fantasy First Down. I'll be back soon with tight end rankings.